of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello, everyone. Hi. I need to grab your attention. It's the worst possible role at the worst possible moment of the evening. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. Hi. I'm Ryan Heath, and it is good to be back. Thank you for having me back in Brussels. We've got Ambassador Smith coming up in a second, but we've got some announcements to make beforehand for the #1 doers, dreamers, and disruptor from our list. So without further ado, our #1 doer played against type and allowed the sanctions against Russia to come as far as they did. His fans like to think of him as the real chancellor. So of course, I'm referring to none other than Robert Habeck, the Minister for the Economy and Climate of Germany. He should be appearing on this screen any second now. He was, good, excellent, okay. Now, our #1 dreamer, unfortunately, is a rarity in a political class that is a little bit too populated by male dinosaurs. This person is our favorite party leader in Europe, none other than Sanna Marin, the Prime Minister of Finland. And our #1 disruptor is definitely a capital D disruptor. They are a fan of NATO. They have a hard line against the Kremlin, and they are absolutely pinky promise swear not going to leave the European Union anytime soon. Her fans refer to her as La Duce, Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy. I thought we might get some of those reactions in this crowd. On that note, I would like to invite to the stage Julianne Smith, the Ambassador to NATO for the great United States. Welcome, Ambassador. This clock is lying to us here. It says we've got 2 minutes and 54 seconds.
Oh,
so,
right.
you know,
I
promise we've got a little bit longer.
Just one question. That's all you get.
Now, I wanted to marry a couple of threads, Ambassador, from what President Metsola was saying in her interview with Jamil and a comment you made to me at our table, and it's around China. So NATO works by consensus, but President Metsola mentioned a couple of conflicting tensions. You know, the desire to cooperate more in and with Asia on global challenges, and this dependence that Europe and a lot of other countries have on China in critical areas. So I'm fascinated to hear what has been the most successful argument you make around the NATO ambassadors table for convincing other allies, the ones who aren't at the front of the line, to bear down on China, to get them to take the threat more seriously?
Well, it hasn't taken that much convincing. I mean, we, inside the NATO alliance, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Great to be here tonight. Wonderful venue, terrific crowd. Inside NATO, we have been, for quite some time, looking at the China challenge. This is not new. It didn't show up last week. It wasn't a month ago. It wasn't even before the Madrid summit this summer. Really, for years, I think collectively the alliance has sat around the table and thought about what China is doing in and around the Euro-Atlantic area. So this isn't about NATO suddenly rushing into the Indo-Pacific or going into the South China Sea. This is, in essence, about NATO realizing that China increasingly is using things like malicious cyber attacks, economic coercion, disinformation to shape the environment in and around around the Euro-Atlantic area, and that's the reason why just this summer the NATO alliance came together and put China in the strategic concept for the first time. So we are now in agreement. There are 30 allies that sat around the table just this summer and made that determination that the alliance had to, while it was focusing on Russia, also needed to recognize that China is a systemic challenge.
And is there a connection there in the sense that this inclusion of China in the concept is a hedge against Taiwan becoming the next Ukraine?
No, I think, again, the allies came together and understood that China is the country that has both the intent and the array of tools, whether it's economic, whether it's political, whether it's military, the tools to reshape the international order. And for that reason, the allies felt compelled to acknowledge that intent and think about what it can now do, now that it put China into the strategic concept. How do we then develop policies and tools that will help us counter some of the efforts to reshape the world order?
And you're happy where it's at, or do we need to move a bit quicker?
Absolutely, very happy where it's at, and now the hard work begins, because the way things work inside the NATO alliance is you start by laying the groundwork, reaching agreement on the nature of the challenge, so we have that with this mission statement that we rolled out this summer, and now we've got to move from, in essence, assessing the challenge to addressing it, and we'll start to do good work in all sorts of areas, including critical infrastructure, supply chains, resilience. There's plenty of work to be done.
Switching topics to Ukraine now, I think we'll spend a fair chunk of the interview on that. Politico sat down with the Prime Minister of Lithuania yesterday, and she says it's time to give Ukraine long-range missiles. Now, I know that's been a sensitive topic in Washington. Where do you stand on that? Is it time to start delivering more for Ukraine?
Well, we're delivering collectively a lot to Ukraine each and every day, and we started that even before February 24th when Russia went into Ukraine. So, I mean, look, you know the story on this, that when the war started, in essence, allies came together and each ally had to take its own sovereign decision how it wanted to support Ukraine. Some allies are providing security assistance, others to reserve the right to just do humanitarian and economic. But we obviously, first and foremost, in those first few weeks of the war, were focused on air defense.
Yep.
And then we shifted. It shifted to coastal defense. And then we focused on munitions. You'll remember in the summer, that was a big focus. We're back to air defense for all the obvious reasons, because of these relentless attacks that the Russians are undertaking against Ukraine's critical infrastructure. They're trying very hard to leave the Ukrainian people in the dark and the cold this winter. And so this is an evolving discussion. We at NATO, individual allies, talk to our friends in Kyiv frequently. We assess what their needs are in real time. We listen to the commanders on the ground. This is all coordinated through a U.S. process, the contact group, the Ramstein group. And so it will continue to evolve. And right now, again, the focus is on air defense. Could it evolve to something else in the coming months? Perhaps. But I think we've done a good job of listening to them and hearing what lessons they're learning on the battlefield and what their needs are.
We've had reporting that the HIMARS systems may have been tweaked by the US before delivery to Ukraine, so they can't reach deep into Russia to military bases. Is that something you're able to confirm?
I don't have anything to share on that tonight. Nothing for you.
On the munitions, we've had challenges. So we saw at the Reagan National Defense Forum last weekend, senior officials from the US Armed Forces saying they're producing munitions at 2 to 3 times the rate that they were before the war, and they'll be double that again by 2025. But then some of the types of artillery that get to Ukraine are used almost as soon as they get there. What's your read on that state of play? Is there anything more that can be done to meet that challenge? And how long are these supplies going to be able to last? Are we talking like a month, 2 months, a year?
Yes, so there's two things at play here, and this is in essence kind of what we'd say in the States is the $64,000 question. And by that I mean there is first and foremost the issue of ensuring that the Ukrainians have the munitions they need to defend their territory and prevail. And that is priority number one for the 50+ countries that are now supporting Ukraine with security assistance. That is being handled in the contact group that is led by the United States, where again, those 50 countries sit around the table and talk about how you can get munitions faster to the Ukrainian forces. But there's a second issue, and that's what we're handling at NATO. As countries in the NATO alliance move munitions into Ukraine, it's obviously diminishing their own national stockpiles so that they have questions about their own national defense. And there's a broader question for the alliance in terms of what signals could we collectively send to industry so that they will open up those production lines faster and quicker and not only backfill allies, but ensure that we can then purchase additional munitions or donate them to the forces on the ground in Ukraine. So we're handling both of those in two different forums, but what we're doing is bring the private sector in. We're convening the armaments directors from all NATO ally countries.
And that's a forward look as well.
Yeah.
Like, because, for example, some critics would say, hang on, we were producing all the wrong things before this war, and we were maybe too optimistic that this type of war was a thing of the past. So I'm wondering if there are lessons that are being applied now in those relationships with the defense contractors.
I mean, we are learning lessons each and every day as this war unfolds, and obviously this is a war that's very conventional in some ways. It's relying on traditional pieces of armor, and you're right, for the United States, I mean, it has been a long time since the United States, for example, has produced something like Javelins or Stingers, and so we're going back to systems that we thought we wouldn't see those lines be turned back on, but in fact now we see the need, both for countries on the eastern flank and for our friends in Ukraine. So you're right, it is making us reflect on what it is required for this conflict and for the Ukrainians to prevail. But it's a different list than I think we would have made 2 years ago, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And now another list that evolves every single day are the cyber and hybrid threats that have been very prominent in this conflict. NATO did a big exercise last week on cybersecurity.
Exactly,
and we did an investigation that was published today that showed a lot of countries were selling to African governments that maybe don't have the best track record on human rights, for example, malware, spyware, other cyber weapons. And so the question there isn't about a specific African country. It's about this idea of controlling where our weapons go and how they're used. So an analogy back to sort of the restrictions on what's getting to Ukraine there. Where do you think NATO needs to draw the line on cyber exports?
Well, look, this really comes back to your first question, and that was on the subject of China. And in this case, we're really looking at actors like the Chinese or like the Russians or other actors around the world that increasingly are trying to reshape the order to meet their set of values, which are fundamentally different from those represented here in this room or through the NATO alliance. And so the question on the table for NATO and NATO allies, first and foremost, is, are NATO allies protecting their own networks? 2, are the national capitals of all those allies undertaking every step they can to ensure that they're developing the right mix of either defensive or offensive capabilities, and they all have to make that determination. 3, what inside the NATO alliance can we do to create a capability so that when an ally is attacked, we can then get them the assistance they need? And lastly, back to your point about this cyber exercise, where NATO partners were in the room, how can the NATO alliance work with its partners? NATO has 40 partners around the world to help them fortify their resilience against these types of attacks. So it's kind of concentric circles, I guess, is the way I would describe it. And we're working our way through the first 2 or 3, but this is an ongoing piece of work for us. And if you look at the strategic concept that was rolled out in Madrid, you see that cyber features quite prominently in that mission statement, so to speak.
And is it fair to say that the alliance is now finally listening to the Baltics a bit more? That exercise was in Estonia. We know they're leaders in this type of defense.
Well, look, I mean, the Estonians, I mean, there are many allies that can say this, in fact, just about everybody, but the Estonians really have experienced cyber attacks up close and personal in a way that not everybody appreciates. And what they went through in 2008, experiencing those attacks from Russia, they have a lot of lessons to share. They have a lot of expertise. They've moved to digitize a lot of their public sector, and we all can draw lessons from that. But that also brings me to another point on China, and that is that we're widening the table at NATO. We don't just talk amongst ourselves. We're bringing in Asia-Pacific partners, so a country like South Korea can come and tell us, or Australia, how they're dealing with emerging and disruptive technology. So what we're in essence trying to do inside the NATO alliance right now, to a certain degree, is to bridge that divide in some ways between the Asia-Pacific and the Atlantic, and say, look, fundamentally, countries like China and Russia, are using the same hybrid tactics, and so what can we share and learn from each other?
Switching it up to burden sharing now. Supporting Ukraine doesn't come for free, and the burdens change over time. So I'm wondering, the current arrangements where the EU tends to lead on frontline refugees, humanitarian, in future reconstruction, US takes on the bulk of the military responsibilities. Is that a sustainable balance? Do you see the balance changing over the next 12 months?
Oh, I mean, it's already changed. I mean, so much has changed since February 24th. I mean, where do we start? But I guess just because you asked about, well, yeah, that's a good question as well. But on the EU, I mean, we could talk about Germany, we could talk about Finland and Sweden coming into the alliance. There's a lot. The sands are shifting beneath our feet. But in terms of the EU, to watch the EU dedicate the resources that it has to make the determination that, in fact, the European Peace Facility will now be helping contribute to the provision of lethal assistance to Ukraine is a big shift. And so I don't think it's fair necessarily to divide the world up into NATO does the hard stuff and the European Union does the soft stuff. There's tremendous crossover, and the relationship between the EU and NATO has changed so much since this war began, where both organizations are in essence in the lead and cooperating all the time. So it's in essence a good news story.
You don't sort of grip the arms on your chair when some of the money gets held up at the EU summits, do you?
I don't break out in hives. No, it's fine.
Very good.
It's just
Very
fine.
good. You heard it here first, people.
No. I work at NATO, so I don't have to. I leave that to somebody else downtown.
When it comes to the reconstruction, I think some countries are keen to follow this model of the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. Do you, in the United States government, sort of fall into that category? How do you think the reconstruction should unfold?
Well, it's probably the most important question that we need to collectively address. I mean, honestly, what we do day in and day out inside the NATO alliance is really try and determine how we can get more practical assistance to those Ukrainian forces defending Ukraine's sovereignty. But what has to be an equal part of that conversation is how do the Ukrainians want to tackle reconstruction, and how can all of those countries that are aiding Ukraine right now ensure that Ukraine has the resources in the future to rebuild? And that is a very important question. But I don't think anybody really has a set idea right now on how that's going to unfold.
Last Ukraine-themed question, or second last Ukraine-themed question, I promise. We're standing between people and their dinner, so I'm conscious of that.
It's not a good place
no,
to,
never a good place to
this
be.
Indicates
exactly.
that,
Big timer. We are big
time
timers. You're right.
Yeah.
Well done, the person in charge of the screen. Jens Stoltenberg, widely praised for his role, got a one-year extension
He's
to
done
his
a terrific job.
Because it was a hot conflict in Ukraine.
Yes.
Still a hot conflict. Would you be open to an extension if the circumstances sort of push for it later on?
I'm not going to answer that, you know.
What would be a reasonable timeline for answering that?
Look, we came together last year.
When can we book you for an answer?
But
you love him. You love Jens Stoltenberg.
We all, I mean, look, he's done a superb job. I mean, really. It's 30 nations that sit around the table each and every day, and we all bring different perspectives, different histories. We sit in different places around the world. Occasionally, you might imagine that we disagree. And here's a guy who came in and has really done a superb job, I think, leading the alliance in a really critical year. We're going to look back on 2022 as a really pivotal moment for the alliance. So.
Now, you are a diplomat, so sorry for the final question.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes. I know I get a lot of questions about what it might mean if Donald Trump were to return to the White House. I don't want you to tell me what you think about that, but how do you handle those questions when colleagues put that to you?
How I handle those questions is to state fact, and that is that the NATO alliance, I'm in a wonderful place in the sense that the NATO alliance enjoys deep bipartisan support across Congress and amongst the American people. And I have faith in that, and I am not worried. I think NATO's in a really good spot back home.
Thank you for those words of reassurance, Ambassador.
All right, thank you.
You are now all entitled to get dinner. We're going to make that happen for you.
Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.